Hello, and welcome to the first round of the Year 10 QDU Academy training sessions for 2023. Today, we're going to be discussing the first long prep topic for Year 10 this year, which is that the Senate should be selected by random lottery. There's going to be a few things that are going to be covered in this session. Firstly, we're going to sort of discuss the context behind this debate, what the status quo looks like and why the debate is being set. We're then going to look at setup, look at the characterizations that you want to consider within this debate and have a look at modeling. And then we're going to get into brainstorming points, which is going to be a combination of how to think about the debate, some tips for the debate itself, but also a bit of a recap of debating because this is the first debate for this year. The first thing to look at in the context of why this debate is taking place is to look at how the Senate is currently elected. The first thing to observe is that under the status quo, there are 12 senators from each state. Importantly, it is the same number for each state, no matter how many people live there. So, New South Wales, the state with the most people living there, has the same number of senators as Tasmania, the state with the smallest number of people living there. And this is different from the House of Representatives, where each state has a number of seats proportional to their population. The reason for this is that it means that smaller states that could get voted against a lot in the House of Representatives by virtue of having a smaller number of seats are able to hold the larger states accountable in the Senate to make sure that they are not always voted against. However, you may consider in preparing for this debate whether you think that is a good or a bad reason. The second thing to look at in regards to the status quo of the Senate is that every 3 years, half of the Senate is up for election. Australia holds federal elections approximately once every 3 years, and this means that at one election, half of the Senate is up for election, and at the next election, that half stays on without needing to be re-elected. However, the other half would then be up for election. This means that each senator currently serves for 6 years on each term, but half of the Senate is replaced halfway through that term. The next piece of context to look at is who is currently in the Senate. So on this slide, I'm going to look at which political parties are represented in the Senate and a lot of demographic details about which types of people are currently in the Senate. The first thing to look at is that in the current Senate, there are 26 members of the Labour Party, 32 senators that represent what is often referred to as the coalition. This is the Liberal Party and the National Party and the LNP. And there are 18 senators that come from what we refer to as the crossbench. The crossbench is basically any member of parliament who does not come from one of the two major parties. Of the current crossbench, there are 11 from the Green Party, 2 from Pauline Hanson's One Nation, 2 from the Jackie Lambie Network, 1 from Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, and 2 independent senators that are not members of any political party. These 2 independent senators are David Pocock, a former rugby player from the Australian Capital Territory, and Lydia Thorpe, a former Green senator who left that party earlier this year. Secondly, under the status quo, there are currently 43 women in the Senate and 33 men. This looks like women are overrepresented in the Senate, and that is true at this current instance. However, historically, men have been far more overrepresented in the Senate. This is only the second time that there have been more women than men. In the House of Representatives, it is dramatically more in favor of there being many more men than the broader population. The next thing to look at is that there are currently 7 Indigenous senators, and there are 2 Muslim senators. Interestingly, this is dramatically smaller than the total Muslim population of Australia and slightly above the broader population of Australia that identifies as Indigenous. However, you might consider whether it's in fact a good thing that there are more Indigenous senators than the broader population because they are a uniquely marginalised group and therefore possibly deserve more of a voice. There are 5 openly queer senators. This is also slightly smaller than the broader population. And there are 2 senators under 30, which is incredibly smaller than the broader population, where about 20% of voters are under 30, and there are only 11 senators under 40, compared to 40% of the broader population who is in the voting age that are under 40. Finally, there is 1 senator who is a wheelchair user, that is Green Senator Jordan Steele-John. However, in the broader Australian demographic, over 10% of Australians have a visible disability, so only having 1 of 76 senators having a visible disability is dramatically smaller than the broader population. If you want to do more research for yourself about I guess, sort of the diversity within Parliament and whether it is good enough or bad enough, or whether there are certain things, other things we could do to change that. There's a link on the screen right now. There's another link that will go to how voting for the Senate works in more detail about how the votes are counted. I think that's probably not hugely relevant to this debate, but it is a very interesting process and a very arduous and long process. And a final source that's about, can a citizen lottery govern better than elected officials? You might find this useful, you might not, because it's about the Senate in the US primarily, but there are lots of similarities between the United States and the Australian systems. A couple more things that you might not know about the Senate. One of them is that the Senate may amend any bill sent to them by the House of Representatives, but there are some types of bills that the Senate cannot introduce themselves. These include money or taxation bills. Those can only be initially proposed in the House of Representatives, and then the Senate can choose to amend them afterwards. In addition to voting on bills in the Senate chamber, senators are often on what we call committees that investigate and scrutinize proposed legislation. There are specific committees for certain types of legislation. You might want to do a bit more research into what types of legislation have existing committees and how you think that interacts with the role of the Senate. Okay. What we're now going to look at is, beyond just the context of the debate, how you should approach it from a debating perspective. The first thing to look at is defining the topic. I think that lots of the topics in this particular debate are fairly self-explanatory and don't require much work to define. For example, I think the Senate is something that is very clear. However, you might want to look into, do you think that the Senate in this debate refers specifically to the federal parliament, or if it also refers to the upper house in state parliaments? In Queensland, we only have one house in our state parliament. However, in every other state of Australia, there are two, meaning that there's one Senate per state except Queensland. You can also look at selected. You can also look at what you think a random lottery looks like. However, I would advise that in terms of defining a random lottery, this is more likely to be a model than a definition in this particular debate, and I'd encourage you to consider whether it's more strategic to put that in a model than a definition. The next thing that we're going to look at is modeling and counter-modeling in this particular debate. I think that this is a debate where having a very clear model that you understand quite well is very important, because it will affect the types of arguments that you can run from both sides of the debate, and I think therefore you need to be very conscious and deliberate in what you make your model. I'm going to go through a series of questions that I think you should ask yourselves and come up with answers to about what you think you should do in regards to your model. And at the end of this slide, I encourage you to pause the video and, as an individual or as a team, sort of think for a moment about how you would answer each of these questions and how you think you would model this debate. We're then going to come back to it in a bit after we've discussed brainstorming points to make sure that your model is not something that is likely to contradict your points or make them worse. I think that the first thing to look at from the affirmative team is a question of who is going to be included in your random lottery. There are a number of decisions that you could take in regards to this. For example, you could look at this in a not dissimilar way to jury duty. For jury duty, any person that is on the voter roll, that is to say, any person that can vote in an election, is eligible to be selected for jury duty. This could mean that you say that every single person could be a member of the Senate. However, you could think that there are certain groups that you think should not be allowed to be members of the Senate. I think that this is a question you should think carefully about. If you say that there are some groups that should not be selected, this may mean that those groups are likely to be underrepresented in the new Senate. However, there may be good enough reasons for excluding them that means that that's a risk that you are worth taking. The other thing to consider is whether people are allowed to say no to being put in the Senate. For example, if we look at jury duty again, there are some reasons why people are allowed to opt out of jury duty. If, for example, they are severely ill, or if they have burdens that they need to take on at home that mean that they cannot afford the time to be a juror. Ask yourselves the question of, are there reasons why you are allowed to say no to being a member of the Senate? And is this something that people are allowed to opt out of? Again, I don't think there is a correct or an incorrect answer to it, but just make sure that you've thought about the question because it may affect the way that you run your arguments. The third thing to think about is anything else going to change when you introduce this? As we established earlier, under the status quo, senators are elected for 6-year terms. You may think that this is a good amount of time, and you'll keep it the same. You may think that if you are elected randomly, you should reduce, or maybe you should increase it. But just think about that kind of question, and if you would like to change it. Similarly, you might want to think about whether you should introduce a term limit on the number of times you are allowed to be selected. Under the status quo, senators can be elected as many times as they get the votes to do so. However, you may think that you should only be allowed to win the Senate lottery once. Again, this is something that I don't think there is a correct or incorrect answer to, but just make sure that you've thought about it because it could affect your arguments. From the negative team, you should also think about, are there any alternative ways to solving some of the problems that may exist within the status quo? You may think that the status quo is working fine, and in that case, you might think there is no reason to change anything. I think this is, in most cases, I think that it is never an incorrect move for a negative team to support the status quo. However, there are also good reasons to introduce some changes. For example, if you think that there are some problems that could be solved in regards to certain groups being underrepresented, you might want to look at, are there other ways to increase representation that don't require it being random? For example, affirmative action models. Or you might want to look at, if you think a problem is a lack of term limits, you could introduce that without needing to have a random lottery. I don't think there is a correct or incorrect answer to it, but I think it's another thing that is worth considering from the negative team, because it will affect whether you want to respond to the affirmative team's arguments by agreeing with the problem, but disagreeing with the way to solve it, or by disagreeing with the problem itself. As I hinted at before we get into brainstorming point ideas, I want you to pause the video and think for a moment about the answers to each of the questions that I asked on the previous slide, and think about, as you will now know the side of the debate that you are on, how you would like to model, or how you would like to countermodel, if you want to countermodel at all, this particular debate. Okay, what we're going to look at now is brainstorming point ideas. I think that this is another point where you should pause the video for a moment and sort of think about arguments for the affirmative or the negative team. Work in groups and consider your arguments. In the session that we ran, people were working in groups in breakout rooms and they would nominate a speaker to present their ideas. Consider things, for example, such as who are the different stakeholders that we should care about? People such as current senators, or people who may get elected to the Senate under this model, or perhaps people that are currently in the House of Representatives who will change who they are working with in the Senate. Think about how all of these groups of people may be affected by this policy. You may also want to think about, is there a principled argument about which side is better for democracy? Is the current Senate system a democratic system? Is it more or less democratic to have it be a random lottery? These are just some simple prompts for you to then think about, are these things good or bad? Are these things likely or unlikely to happen? And think about your point ideas from that perspective. At this point in the Zoom session, we had people share their ideas about this debate, and we considered the arguments and how we would run them in the debate. Hopefully you've now taken a moment to think about arguments yourself, and we're going to move on to a slide, which is my helpful hints as to how to build an argument. I think there are 3 things that you should always consider when building your argument. Often you will have been told to structure debating arguments similar to how you would structure an argument in an essay, by establishing a clear point label, thinking of evidence that supports that claim, building up examples that illustrate your argument, and thinking of good reasons why things are likely to be true before linking back to the topic. I think that when you enter Year 10 debating, there are possibly a couple of things that you could think of beyond this structure while still keeping the same ideas. The first thing, I think, is to keep your point label the same as it would have been before. The point label is a very helpful thing to make sure that your argument immediately stands out and is very clear to the adjudicator. One good philosophy is to think of a point label as a sentence which, if true, is a reason why your team should win the debate. Obviously, you would then need to prove that it is true, but that's how to make sure that your sentence is impactful. The second thing to think of is give reasons why your argument is likely to be true. This looks like saying why things are likely to change in the way that you say so, why certain changes that you say are likely to exist are going to lead to certain outcomes. It is very important to make sure that your argument has everything proven within it and is not a series of assertions, because this is far more persuasive to the adjudicator. The next thing to establish, and something that may be slightly new to you, is the idea of what we often refer to as impacting an argument. The question that you should think of is, why is this important? Proving that arguments are important is a crucial part to winning a debate, because it bridges the gap from proving that something is true to proving why the adjudicator should care that it is true, and why it is important enough for the adjudicator to say that it is a reason why your team wins the debate. This looks like explaining why a certain impact that is caused under your side is likely to be particularly good, or why an impact under the opposing team's side is likely to be particularly bad. Establish why this is so important and why the adjudicator should award the debate on that basis. The other thing to consider is asking yourself the question of what things look like. This can occur at any stage within the argument. It's where you put your classical examples and your evidence, your sort of illustration of what your argument looks like beyond just the words of debating and sort of very much in the real world. In this particular debate, important things to be making sure that you illustrate are, what does it look like for certain groups to be represented in Parliament? What does it look like for good or bad policy to be passed? What do those things look like? What examples are likely to exist? The final thing to do in your argument is link it back. This means linking back from your argument to the topic. So, for example, why the point that you've said means that the Senate should or should not be selected by random lottery. I think that keep a clear note of the 3 questions currently on this slide, because I think that constantly asking yourselves these questions when writing an argument is always going to make it more persuasive to the adjudicator. It's going to either make it more true, or it's going to make it matter more to the adjudicator, or it's going to make it look more realistic in the real world to the adjudicator. And all of these things are very persuasive tools to keep on hand. Perhaps pause the video now and look at one of the arguments that you thought of before and use this structure to try and write this argument in a very persuasive way and present it to a teammate and see what they think about it. Finally, we're going to look at some helpful hints that we have for this particular debate. One thing to think about is to think about what else might change when senators are selected randomly. Perhaps this is that senators are now less likely to be members of political parties. Maybe it means that they are likely to form groups when they are elected. There are many answers to these kind of questions, but it's something to think about. Think about this debate beyond just the impact on the senator at the moment when they are elected, and what else could change. The second thing to consider is, how will the House of Representatives interact with the Senate if this policy is enacted? Currently, the House of Representatives interacts quite a lot with the Senate, because the people are often members of the same political parties. They know each other well. However, now this may not be the case. Is this change in the interaction between them going to be good or bad? The third helpful hint is focus on weighing up in rebuttal. This means not just proving why something is true, but proving why it is more important than the argument that the other team is bringing, and why, even if some part of what the other team is saying makes sense, it is less important than what you are saying. Finally, just in regards to rebuttal, if we look back at the structure for an argument that I gave you earlier, look at, for example, proving both that the arguments that the opposition have brought forward are both wrong and that they are unimportant. This means not just proving that they are untrue, but proving that possibly, even if they are true, it is not something that the adjudicator should credit them with the win for. This was the slide where we asked people if they had any questions during the session. If you have further questions about this season of debating, direct your emails to the admin@qdu.org.au. Finally, thank you very much for watching this video. I wish you the best of luck for this debate and for the rest of the season to come.